Margaret Chen stood at the ship's railing, watching the endless blue ocean stretch toward the horizon. The cruise ship was massive, carrying over 3,000 passengers, but somehow she felt invisible among the crowd. At 68 years old, she had learned to blend into the background, especially after her husband David passed away 2 years ago. The other passengers barely noticed her. Young couples walked past, absorbed in their honeymoon bliss. Families rushed by, chasing excited children. Even the ship's crew seemed to look right through her when she asked simple questions about dining times or deck activities. Margaret had booked this Mediterranean cruise hoping to find some joy again, but 3 days in, she felt more alone than ever. She wore simple clothes, a plain blue cardigan, and comfortable walking shoes. Her gray hair was neatly pulled back and she carried a small purse with her essentials. Nothing about her appearance suggested she was anyone special. She looked like countless other elderly women taking their first solo vacation after losing their spouse. Margaret spent most of her time in quiet corners of the ship. She would sit in the library reading or find a peaceful spot on deck to watch the waves. The loud pool parties and evening shows felt overwhelming. She preferred the gentle sound of water against the hull and the warmth of the Mediterranean sun on her face. During meals, she often ate alone at small tables, politely declining invitations from other solo travelers who seemed to pity her solitude. She wasn't being rude. She simply wasn't ready to explain her story to strangers. The pain of losing David was still too fresh, and she needed this time to figure out who she was without him. The cruise staff were professional but distant. They served her meals, cleaned her modest interior cabin, and answered her questions with practiced smiles. No one took the time to really see her or understand that beneath her quiet exterior was a woman with an extraordinary past that she had spent decades keeping secret. Margaret had chosen this particular cruise because it would stop in several ports she had never visited. She wanted to see new places, maybe find some spark of adventure that would help her move forward. But as she stood on deck that evening, watching the sunset paint the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks, she wondered if she had made a mistake. The ship was heading toward the Greek islands, and tomorrow they would dock in Rhodes. Margaret had read about the ancient history there, the medieval walls and beautiful beaches. Maybe tomorrow would be different. Maybe she would find the courage to join a shore excursion or strike up a conversation with another passenger. As the evening grew cooler, Margaret pulled her cardigan tighter and headed back to her cabin. She passed the main dining room where hundreds of passengers were enjoying their dinner, laughing and celebrating their vacations. The sound of clinking glasses and cheerful conversations followed her down the narrow corridor to her room. Back in her small cabin, Margaret looked at herself in the mirror. She saw an ordinary woman, a widow trying to find her way in the world again. She had no idea that in just a few days everything would change. She had no idea that her carefully guarded secret was about to be revealed in the most dramatic way possible. Margaret settled into her narrow bed, listening to the gentle rocking of the ship. Tomorrow would bring new islands, new sights, and new opportunities to remain invisible among the crowds. She closed her eyes and tried to imagine what David would think of this journey. He had always encouraged her to be brave, to step out of her comfort zone. But some secrets were meant to stay buried, weren't they? As sleep finally came, Margaret dreamed of her younger self, of choices made long ago that had shaped her entire life. She dreamed of uniforms and ceremonies, of courage and sacrifice that no one around her could possibly imagine. In her dreams, she was someone important, someone whose actions had mattered. But when morning came, she would wake up as just another overlooked passenger on a crowded cruise ship, with no idea that her past was about to catch up with her in the most unexpected way. The next morning brought rough seas and gray skies. Margaret woke to the sound of rain pattering against her small porthole window. The ship was rocking more than usual, and she could hear announcements over the intercom about choppy waters and potential delays in reaching Rhodes. In the dining room, many passengers looked queasy from the ship's movement. Margaret, however, felt perfectly steady. She had experienced much rougher conditions than this, though the other passengers around her had no way of knowing that. She calmly ate her breakfast while others struggled with their coffee cups sliding across the tables. A young couple at the next table was arguing about whether to take seasickness medication. The woman looked pale and kept gripping the edge of the table. Margaret quietly stood up and approached them. "Excuse me," she said softly. "Try looking at the horizon through that window there and keep your feet flat on the floor. It helps with the motion. The young woman looked up at Margaret with surprise. Most people had been too focused on their own discomfort to offer help. "Thank you," she said gratefully. "Are you used to boats?" Margaret paused for just a moment. "I've spent some time on ships," she replied simply, then returned to her table. She didn't mention that she had once navigated through storms that would terrify these cruise passengers, or that she had learned to keep her balance on vessels much smaller and less stable than this luxury liner. As the morning progressed, the weather worsened. The captain announced that they would not be able to dock in Rhodes as planned. Instead, they would head toward Crete and wait for the storm to pass. Many passengers grumbled about the change in itinerary, but Margaret didn't mind. She had learned long ago that some things were beyond human control. She made her way to one of the upper decks, despite the crew's suggestions that passengers stay indoors. The wind was strong and most of the deck chairs had been secured or moved inside. Margaret found a sheltered spot and watched the waves crash against the ship's hull. The raw power of the ocean reminded her of other times, other storms she had weathered. A ship's officer approached her, looking concerned. "Ma'am, it might be safer if you went inside. This weather is getting pretty rough." Margaret smiled at the young man. He couldn't be more than 25, probably new to working on ships. "I'll be fine," she assured him. "I know how to handle rough weather." The officer looked puzzled by her confidence but didn't argue. There was something in her calm demeanor that suggested she knew what she was talking about. He nodded and continued his rounds, but Margaret noticed him glancing back at her with curiosity. By afternoon, the storm had intensified. The ship was now in what maritime professionals would classify as heavy seas. Most passengers had retreated to their cabins or gathered in the interior lounges. The ship's entertainment staff was working overtime to keep everyone distracted with movies, games, and activities away from the windows. Margaret, however, remained on deck. She had moved to a more protected area, but she continued to watch the storm with a practiced eye. She could read the waves, understand the wind patterns, and assess the ship's handling of the conditions. Everything told her they were safe, despite the dramatic appearance of the weather. A small group of crew members had gathered nearby, discussing the storm and the ship's course adjustments. Margaret couldn't help but overhear their conversation. One of them, a junior officer, was expressing concern about their current heading. "We should move further west," he said nervously. "This course is taking us too close to those shallow areas." Margaret bit her tongue. She could see from the ship's position and the wave patterns that they were actually taking the safest possible route. The junior officer was reading the charts correctly, but misunderstanding the practical implications. She wanted to speak up, but how could she explain her knowledge without revealing things she had kept secret for decades? As evening approached, the storm began to subside slightly. The ship's captain made another announcement, explaining that they would continue toward Crete and hopefully dock there the following morning. Most passengers seemed relieved that the worst appeared to be over. Margaret finally went inside as the light faded. In the elevator, she met an elderly gentleman who had been struggling with seasickness all day. "You seem to handle rough seas well," he commented, looking at her with admiration. "Most of us have been green around the gills all day." "Practice," Margaret replied with a small smile. "Lots of practice." The man nodded, assuming she meant previous cruise experiences. He had no idea that Margaret's practice had come from commanding naval vessels through some of the most treacherous waters in the world. He couldn't know that the calm, ordinary-looking woman beside him had once been responsible for the safety of entire crews in conditions far worse than this tourist cruise was experiencing. As Margaret returned to her cabin that night, she reflected on the day. She had managed to help a few people without drawing attention to herself, and she had watched professional mariners do their jobs competently, even if not perfectly. It felt good to be around ships and sea spray again, even as a passenger rather than in command. Tomorrow they would reach Crete, and perhaps the weather would clear. Margaret hoped to explore some of the ancient sites there, to lose herself in history and continue her journey of rediscovering who she was in this new chapter of her life. She had no way of knowing that events were already in motion that would soon reveal her true identity to everyone on board. The morning sun broke through the clouds as the ship approached Crete. Margaret stood on deck early, watching the island grow larger on the horizon. The storm had passed, leaving behind crystal-clear air and calmer seas. Other passengers were emerging from their cabins, excited to finally reach a port after the previous day's rough weather. Margaret had dressed simply again, a comfortable walking outfit, and her sensible shoes. She planned to explore the Palace of Knossos, the ancient Minoan ruins she had read about in her guidebook. It would be a peaceful way to spend the day, walking through history while the younger passengers headed to beaches and shopping areas. As the ship docked in Heraklion port, Margaret joined the line of passengers waiting to disembark. Around her, families discussed their plans. Couples debated which tours to take, and groups of friends excitedly planned their day. Margaret listened quietly, content with her solo adventure. The port was busy with several cruise ships and local fishing boats. Margaret walked slowly through the terminal, taking in the sights and sounds of the Greek island. The air smelled of salt water and fresh fish from the nearby market. Local vendors were already setting up their stalls, hoping to catch the attention of the tourists streaming off the ships. Margaret found a small cafe near the port and ordered a coffee and pastry. She spread her map on the small table and planned her route to the archaeological site. The bus tour groups were already forming, but she preferred to take public transportation and explore at her own pace. As she sipped her coffee, Margaret noticed a commotion at the harbor. Several official-looking vehicles had arrived, and uniformed personnel were talking urgently with the port authorities. It looked like some kind of security situation, but Margaret didn't think much of it. Ports always had various officials coming and going. She finished her coffee and made her way to the local bus stop. The bus to Knossos was crowded with tourists, and Margaret found a seat near the back. The ride took about 20 minutes through the countryside, passing olive groves and small villages that looked like they hadn't changed in decades. The Palace of Knossos was everything Margaret had hoped for. The ancient ruins were extensive, with partially reconstructed walls and colorful frescoes that gave visitors a sense of what the palace might have looked like 3,000 years ago. Margaret moved slowly through the site, reading the information plaques and imagining the lives of the people who had once lived there. She was particularly drawn to the sections about Minoan maritime culture. The Minoans had been skilled sailors and traders, building their civilization on their mastery of the sea. Margaret stood for a long time looking at the ancient anchor stones and ship imagery painted on the walls. These people understood the ocean just as she did, though separated by millennia. As the afternoon wore on, Margaret realized she should head back to the ship. The last departure time was clearly posted, and she didn't want to miss the sailing. She caught the return bus to Heraklion, enjoying the countryside views and feeling more relaxed than she had in months. Back at the port, however, something had changed. There were more official vehicles than before, and security personnel seemed to be checking passengers more carefully as they returned to their ships. Margaret noticed helicopters in the distance, though she couldn't tell if they were military or civilian aircraft. When she reached the ship's gangway, the security check was indeed more thorough than usual. The crew member scanning passenger cards looked stressed, and there seemed to be some kind of additional screening process in place. "Ma'am, could you please step aside for a moment?" a ship's security officer asked Margaret politely. Margaret felt a flutter of anxiety. Had she done something wrong? Was there a problem with her documentation? She followed the officer to a small area near the ship's entrance. "We just need to verify some information," the officer explained, looking at a tablet in his hands. "Could you confirm your full name for me?" "Margaret Chen," she replied, though she noticed the officer seemed to be looking for something more. He tapped on his tablet and frowned slightly. "Ma'am, our records show some additional information associated with your passport. Could you tell me if you've ever used any other names professionally?" Margaret's heart began to beat faster. This was exactly what she had hoped to avoid by taking this cruise. She had wanted to travel quietly, without drawing attention to her past. But somehow someone had connected her current identity with her former life. "I'm not sure what you mean," she said carefully. The officer showed her his tablet screen, though he angled it so she couldn't see exactly what information he was looking at. "Ma'am, we've received some inquiries about passengers on this vessel. It appears you might be someone we need to speak with." Margaret realized that her quiet cruise vacation was about to come to an abrupt end. Somehow, despite all her efforts to remain anonymous, her true identity had been discovered. She wondered who could have found her and why, after all these years, someone would be looking for her now. The officer was being polite but firm. It was clear that Margaret wasn't going to be allowed back on the ship until this situation was resolved. She could see other passengers streaming past them, returning from their day trips, completely unaware that the quiet woman they had barely noticed was at the center of some kind of official investigation. As Margaret waited for whatever would happen next, she thought about David. He had always worried that someday her past would catch up with her. He had encouraged her to be proud of her service, but she had chosen to keep it private. Now it seemed that choice was being taken away from her. Margaret sat in the port security office, her hands folded in her lap, trying to remain calm. Through the window, she could see the cruise ship preparing for departure. Other passengers were enjoying their dinner, completely unaware that one of their fellow travelers was being questioned by Greek authorities. The security officer across from her was middle-aged, with kind eyes but a serious expression. He had introduced himself as Captain Dimitrios, and he spoke excellent English. On his desk was a thick folder that Margaret suspected contained information about her that she had hoped would never surface again. "Mrs. Chen," Captain Dimitrios began gently, "we have received a request from the United States Navy to locate you. They have been trying to reach you for several weeks." Margaret's heart sank. She had changed her address when she moved after David's death, and she had deliberately not left forwarding information with many organizations. She had wanted a clean break from her old life, including her military connections. "May I ask what this is regarding?" Margaret asked, though she suspected she already knew. Captain Dimitrios opened the folder and glanced at the documents inside. "Mrs. Chen, according to our information, your full name is Admiral Margaret Elizabeth Chen, United States Navy, retired. Is that correct?" Margaret closed her eyes for a moment. After all these years of being just another widow, just another cruise passenger, her military rank was now front and center again. "Yes," she said quietly. "That's correct. The U.S. Navy has informed us that you are being awarded the Navy Cross, their second highest decoration for valor. Apparently, classified information has recently been declassified that reveals actions you took during your service that warranted this recognition." Margaret felt the room spinning slightly. The Navy Cross was an extraordinary honor, one that was rarely awarded and never given lightly. She had no idea what classified mission they could be referencing, or why it was being recognized now, decades later. "I don't understand," Margaret said honestly. "What actions are they referring to?" Captain Dimitrios consulted his papers again. "The documents mention Operation Silent Shield, conducted in 1987. Does that sound familiar to you?" The name hit Margaret like a physical blow. Operation Silent Shield was something she had never spoken about, not even to David. It was a mission that had been so highly classified that she had sometimes wondered if it had really happened, or if it had been some kind of elaborate training exercise. I can't discuss that operation," Margaret stammered. "Mrs. Chen, the operation has been declassified. The Navy wants to honor you publicly for your actions. Apparently, you saved the lives of several hundred people, prevented an international incident, and demonstrated extraordinary leadership under extreme circumstances." Margaret remembered that night in 1987 with crystal clarity, even though she had tried to forget it for decades. She had been a young commander then, in charge of a small naval vessel conducting what was supposed to be a routine intelligence-gathering mission in international waters. They had intercepted communications indicating that a passenger ferry carrying American tourists was in imminent danger from hostile forces. Margaret had to make a split-second decision that violated several direct orders, but ultimately saved lives. "The ceremony is scheduled for next week at the Pentagon," Captain Dimitrios continued. "The Secretary of the Navy will be presenting the award personally. They've been trying to locate you to extend the invitation." Margaret shook her head. "I never wanted recognition for that mission. It was classified for good reasons. Some things are better left in the past." "Ma'am, with respect, the Navy disagrees. They believe your actions represent the highest traditions of naval service and should be recognized publicly. They've sent a helicopter to transport you from here to Athens, where a military aircraft is waiting to take you to Washington." Margaret looked out the window again and realized that the helicopters she had seen earlier weren't just random aircraft. They were there for her. The thought of being the center of attention at a military ceremony, of having her quiet retirement disrupted by media coverage and official recognition, filled her with dread. "What if I refuse?" she asked. Captain Dimitrios smiled sympathetically. Mrs. Chen, they've asked me to tell you that this is not exactly a request. As a retired flag officer, you can be recalled to active duty for official ceremonies. The Navy has made it clear that they consider your presence at this ceremony to be essential. Margaret realized that her peaceful cruise vacation was definitely over. Her fellow passengers would probably never know that the quiet woman they had ignored was actually a decorated naval hero being summoned by helicopter for one of the military's highest honors. Will I be able to return to the ship? She asked, though she already knew the answer. I'm afraid not. Your luggage is being packed and will be forwarded to you. The helicopter will be here within the hour. Margaret sat back in her chair, trying to process this dramatic turn of events. For decades, she had been just Margaret Chen, Navy widow, trying to figure out how to live the rest of her life quietly. Now she was about to be thrust back into the spotlight as Admiral Chen, decorated war hero. She thought about her fellow passengers, probably wondering vaguely where the quiet woman from the upper deck had gone. They would never know that she had been whisked away by military helicopter for a ceremony at the Pentagon. They would never know that the overlooked woman they had barely noticed was about to receive one of the nation's highest military honors. As Captain Dimitrios made arrangements for her departure, Margaret wondered what David would think of all this. He had always been proud of her service, even the parts she couldn't discuss with him. Maybe it was time to finally accept recognition for actions she had tried to forget. The sound of helicopter rotors grew louder as Margaret waited in the port office. Through the window, she could see her cruise ship preparing to leave without her. Passengers were gathering on deck for the evening departure celebration, completely unaware that one of their fellow travelers was about to be airlifted away for a military ceremony. A young Greek naval officer entered the office and saluted Margaret respectfully. Admiral Chen, the helicopter is ready for you. We also have a message from the U.S. Embassy in Athens. Margaret accepted the sealed envelope with trembling hands. Inside was a letter from the American ambassador, explaining that her story had already begun to attract media attention. The declassification of Operation Silent Shield had been accompanied by a detailed account of her heroic actions, and news outlets were eager to interview the mysterious admiral who had disappeared into retirement. This is exactly what I was trying to avoid, Margaret murmured to herself. Captain Dimitrios overheard her. Ma'am, sometimes heroes don't get to choose when they're recognized. Your country wants to honor you. Perhaps it's time to let them. Margaret gathered her small purse and the few belongings she had carried off the ship that morning. Everything else would be forwarded to her later. As she walked toward the helicopter, she felt like she was stepping out of one life and into another. The helicopter crew treated her with the respect due to a flag officer, helping her aboard and ensuring she was comfortable for the flight to Athens. As they lifted off, Margaret could see the cruise ship below, now looking small against the vast blue of the Mediterranean. She wondered if any of the passengers happened to look up and see the helicopter, not knowing it carried the quiet woman they had barely noticed. The flight to Athens took just over an hour. Margaret stared out at the Greek islands below, thinking about the peaceful vacation that had been so abruptly interrupted. She had wanted time to grieve for David and figure out her future. Instead, she was being thrust back into a world she had left behind decades ago. At Athens airport, a U.S. Air Force transport plane was waiting. The crew was professional and respectful, but Margaret could see the curiosity in their eyes. Word had clearly spread about the mysterious admiral being flown to Washington for an extraordinary ceremony. During the long flight across the Atlantic, Margaret tried to prepare herself for what was coming. She knew that accepting the Navy Cross would mean interviews, media attention, and public scrutiny of her entire naval career. Her quiet retirement would be over permanently. She thought about Operation Silent Shield and that terrifying night in 1987. She had been commanding the USS Seahawk, a small intelligence vessel, when they intercepted urgent communications about a terrorist plot. A passenger ferry carrying 300 American tourists was heading directly into an ambush. Margaret had faced an impossible choice. Her orders were to maintain radio silence and avoid any actions that might compromise their intelligence mission. But she knew that following those orders would mean watching innocent people die. She had ordered her ship to intercept the ferry, breaking radio silence to warn them of the danger. When the terrorists attacked anyway, Margaret had positioned her vessel between the ferry and the hostile boats, using her ship's superior firepower to drive off the attackers. Her actions had saved 300 lives, but they had also compromised a major intelligence operation. For years afterward, Margaret had wondered if she had made the right choice. The mission had been classified at such a high level that she could never discuss it with anyone, not even David. The plane landed at Andrews Air Force Base outside Washington in the early hours of the morning. Margaret was met by a Navy protocol officer who escorted her to a hotel where she could rest before the ceremony. As they drove through the familiar streets of the nation's capital, Margaret felt like she was returning to a world she had deliberately left behind. At the hotel, Margaret finally had time to call her sister in California, the only family member who knew about her military background. "Maggie, I've been seeing your name in the news," her sister said immediately. "They're calling you a hero. They're saying you saved hundreds of lives." Margaret sank into the hotel room chair, exhausted by the day's events. "I just did my job, Linda. I made a decision that seemed right at the time. The news reports are saying you risked your career to save those people. They're saying you disobeyed direct orders." Margaret had never told anyone, including Linda, about the details of that night. "It's complicated. I can't really explain what happened." "Well, you're going to have to explain it tomorrow. The ceremony is being broadcast live on national television. They're expecting you to give a speech." Margaret's heart sank even further. A televised ceremony meant that her story would reach millions of people. Her quiet life was truly over. She would forever be known as the admiral who had risked everything to save a ship full of tourists. As she tried to sleep that night, Margaret thought about the cruise passengers who were probably enjoying their evening entertainment, unaware that the unremarkable woman they had ignored was about to become a national hero. They would probably never know that they had shared a ship with someone whose split-second decision had once changed the course of history. Tomorrow, she would stand before television cameras and accept recognition for actions she had tried to forget. The overlooked woman from the cruise ship was about to become the center of national attention, whether she wanted it or not. The morning of the ceremony dawned bright and clear in Washington. Margaret stood in her hotel room looking at the Navy dress uniform that had been delivered overnight. It had been fitted specifically for her, complete with all the ribbons and decorations she had earned during her 30-year career. She hadn't worn a uniform in over 15 years. As she put on the familiar blue fabric, Margaret felt like she was putting on an old identity that no longer quite fit. Her hand shook slightly as she fastened the buttons and adjusted the ribbons. In the mirror, she saw Admiral Chen looking back at her, not the quiet widow from the cruise ship. A Navy car arrived to take her to the Pentagon. During the drive, Margaret's escort, Commander Rodriguez, briefed her on the ceremony details. The Secretary of the Navy would present the award. There would be speeches from several high-ranking officials, and yes, Margaret would be expected to say a few words. "Ma'am, I should mention that there's quite a bit of media interest in your story," Commander Rodriguez said carefully. "The combination of the heroic actions and the fact that you've been living so quietly has captured public attention." Margaret nodded, dreading what was to come. She had spent decades avoiding publicity, and now she was about to be thrust into the national spotlight. At the Pentagon, Margaret was escorted to a private room where she could collect herself before the ceremony. Through the window, she could see camera crews setting up in the courtyard where the ceremony would take place. There were more reporters and cameras than she had expected. A gentle knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. "Admiral Chen, I'm Captain Sarah Mitchell. I wanted to introduce myself before the ceremony." Margaret turned to see a young woman in Navy uniform, probably in her early 30s. There was something familiar about her earnest expression and confident bearing. "Captain Mitchell, it's nice to meet you. Are you part of the ceremony staff?" "No, ma'am. I'm here because of you, actually." Captain Mitchell paused, seeming to gather her courage. "My father was Chief Petty Officer Robert Mitchell. He was on the passenger ferry you saved in 1987. Margaret felt her breath catch. She had never met any of the people from the ferry, had never known their names or what happened to them after that terrifying night. "Your father was on the ferry?" "Yes, ma'am. He was traveling with my mother and my older brother. I wasn't born yet." Captain Mitchell's eyes filled with tears. "Admiral, my father used to tell me about that night. He said a Navy ship appeared out of nowhere and saved them from certain death. He never knew the name of the ship or the commanding officer, but he used to say that he owed his life to whoever made the decision to help them. Margaret sat down heavily in her chair. For 35 years she had wondered about the people on that ferry, had hoped they had lived good lives after that frightening experience. My father died 5 years ago, Captain Mitchell continued, but he always said he wanted to thank the captain who saved them. When the story broke about Operation Silent Shield, I realized it was you. Admiral, my father lived to see me graduate from the Naval Academy, to see me get married, to meet his grandchildren. None of that would have happened without your decision that night. Margaret wiped away tears she hadn't expected. Captain, I had no idea what happened to the people on the ferry. I've wondered about them for decades. Ma'am, there are others here today. Some of the other passengers from the ferry came to Washington when they heard about the ceremony. They all wanted to thank you personally. Before Margaret could respond, there was another knock on the door. Commander Rodriguez entered to tell her it was time for the ceremony to begin. As they walked toward the courtyard, Margaret felt her perspective shifting. This wasn't just about military recognition anymore. This was about the real people whose lives had been affected by her decision. The courtyard was filled with hundreds of people. Military officials, Pentagon staff, reporters, and cameras were all focused on the small stage where the ceremony would take place. Margaret took her position and tried to calm her nerves. The Secretary of the Navy stepped to the podium and began reading the citation for Margaret's Navy Cross. As he described the events of that night in 1987, Margaret scanned the audience and saw several older civilians who looked like they might be former passengers from the ferry. Admiral Margaret Elizabeth Chen demonstrated extraordinary heroism and complete disregard for her own safety. The secretary read, her decisive action in the face of direct enemy fire saved the lives of 300 innocent civilians and prevented an international incident that could have had far-reaching consequences. When it came time for Margaret to receive the medal, she walked forward with as much dignity as she could muster. The weight of the Navy Cross felt substantial as it was pinned to her uniform. The cameras captured every moment, broadcasting the ceremony to millions of viewers around the world. Then came the moment Margaret had been dreading. She was invited to step to the podium and address the audience. She looked out at the sea of faces, knowing that her words would be heard far beyond this courtyard, somewhere in the Mediterranean. Her former cruise companions were probably enjoying their vacation, unaware that the quiet woman from their ship was now standing at the center of a national ceremony. Margaret took a deep breath and began to speak, finally ready to tell her story to the world. Margaret stepped to the podium and looked out at the hundreds of faces watching her. The cameras were rolling, broadcasting live to millions of viewers. She thought about the cruise passengers who had barely noticed her, who had seen only an unremarkable elderly woman. Now the whole world was listening to her story. Thank you for this extraordinary honor, Margaret began, her voice steady despite her nerves. For 35 years I have wondered if I made the right decision on that night in 1987. Today, meeting Captain Mitchell and knowing that the people we saved went on to live full, meaningful lives, I finally have my answer. She paused, looking directly at the former ferry passengers in the audience. I want to be clear about something. What happened that night wasn't heroic in the way people might imagine. It wasn't a moment of dramatic bravery. It was simply a choice between following orders and doing what I knew was right. When you're faced with that kind of choice, there really is no choice at all. Margaret's voice grew stronger as she continued. I spent my entire naval career trying to be invisible, to do my job quietly and effectively. Even in retirement, I preferred to blend into the background. Just last week, I was on a cruise ship where I was completely overlooked by everyone around me. I was just another elderly widow trying to figure out her place in the world. She smiled slightly. Those fellow passengers had no idea that the unremarkable woman reading quietly on deck had once commanded warships. They couldn't have imagined that I had navigated through storms far worse than the rough weather we encountered. And they certainly never suspected that a helicopter would descend to take me away for a ceremony like this. The audience chuckled at her gentle humor, and Margaret felt some of her tension ease. But here's what I've learned from this experience, Margaret continued, her voice carrying across the silent courtyard. We all carry stories that others can't see. The quiet person sitting next to you might have saved lives. The elderly woman reading alone on a cruise ship might have commanded vessels through dangerous waters. The unremarkable neighbor might have made decisions that changed the course of history. She looked directly into the cameras, knowing her words were reaching far beyond the Pentagon courtyard. My husband David used to tell me that heroism isn't about being noticed or recognized. It's about doing the right thing when no one is watching, when no one will ever know what you did. For 35 years, I thought that night in 1987 would remain classified forever. I was content with that because I didn't act for recognition. I acted because 300 innocent people needed help. Margaret's eyes found Captain Mitchell in the audience. But meeting the children and families of the people we saved has taught me something new. Sometimes our actions ripple forward in ways we never imagine. Captain Mitchell exists because her father survived that night. Her children exist because of a decision I made decades before they were born. The ripples of that one choice have touched generations. She paused, thinking about her fellow cruise passengers, probably now in some other Mediterranean port, still unaware of the drama that had unfolded. The people on my cruise ship saw an ordinary woman grieving her husband and trying to find her way forward. They were right about the grieving part. David's death left me feeling invisible, overlooked, unsure of my purpose. I thought my meaningful days were behind me. Margaret's voice grew emotional. But standing here today, I realize that none of us are ever truly invisible. Our actions matter, even when we think no one is watching. The quiet choices we make, the moments when we choose courage over safety, kindness over indifference, service over self-interest. These decisions echo through time in ways we may never see. She straightened her shoulders, every inch the admiral she had once been. So to anyone watching who feels overlooked or forgotten, who thinks their contributions don't matter, I want you to know this. You are seen. Your choices matter. The world needs your courage, your compassion, your willingness to do what's right even when it's difficult. Margaret looked once more at the medal on her chest, then back at the audience. This Navy Cross doesn't belong just to me. It belongs to everyone who chooses service over self, who stands up when it matters, who remains ready to help even when no one is watching. It belongs to all the invisible heroes who make our world better simply by being in it. As Margaret stepped back from the podium, the courtyard erupted in sustained applause. The former ferry passengers were on their feet, tears streaming down their faces. Military officials stood at attention, saluting not just the decorated admiral, but the quiet woman who had spent decades carrying an extraordinary secret. After the ceremony, Margaret was surrounded by people wanting to meet her, to thank her, to hear her story. The shy cruise passenger was gone, replaced by someone who finally understood that her experiences had value, that her story needed to be told. That evening, as Margaret sat in her hotel room, she received a call from the cruise director of her ship. Word had spread among the passengers about their mysterious fellow traveler, who had been whisked away by helicopter. Admiral Chen, the director said, our passengers are amazed to learn who was traveling with us. They keep saying they wish they had talked to you, gotten to know you. You've become something of a legend on board. Margaret smiled. Please tell them that I was exactly who they thought I was. Just a widow trying to figure out her next chapter. The only difference is that sometimes our next chapters are bigger than we expect. After she hung up, Margaret looked out at the lights of Washington and thought about David. He would have been proud to see her finally accept recognition for her service. More importantly, he would have been happy to see her ready to step out of the shadows and embrace whatever came next. The overlooked woman from the cruise ship was gone forever. In her place stood Admiral Margaret Chen, ready to share her story with the world and to prove that heroes come in all forms, sometimes looking exactly like the unremarkable person sitting quietly beside you, carrying extraordinary secrets and ready to act when courage is needed most. 3 months later, Margaret returned to the same cruise line for another Mediterranean voyage. This time, however, she wore a small Navy crosspin on her jacket, and her fellow passengers approached her with curiosity and respect. She shared stories of her naval career, offered wisdom about leadership and courage, and reminded everyone that the most important journeys often begin when we least expect them. The woman on deck was no longer overlooked, but she had learned that being seen came with the responsibility to help others recognize their own potential for extraordinary action. Margaret Chen had finally found her purpose in this new chapter of life, helping others understand that heroes are made not by recognition, but by the quiet choices we make when we think no one is watching.